My work broadly focuses on trying to understand the interactions between climate, plants, and human changes to our systems. And so the intersection of all three of these important components of the Earth system is just the focus of my work. And I'm particularly interested in how plants sort of mediate some of these processes and respond to these processes. And for example, humans are increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide. See, I think yesterday I didn't know how to use this properly. Today I will. Yes. So here on the y-axis is the carbon dioxide concentration in parts per million. Many of you are probably familiar with this particular graph. And you can see that humans are increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide through time. Probably all well aware of this, but what I really wanted to highlight is this annual cycle, because every year this annual cycle is driven by plants. The northern hemisphere has more landmass than the southern hemisphere, so every year when plants start to leaf out in the spring, they leaf out and they start to draw down carbon dioxide through the process of photosynthesis throughout that growing season. And in the fall, around this time of year, plants lose their leaves, and so respiration starts to dominate. They're not drawing down that carbon dioxide quite as much. And so plants have a really large impact on global carbon processes. And while a single leaf might seem small, if you look at Earth's terrestrial surface, a lot of that is green, and that's because there's a lot of leaves. And so globally aggregated, plants can have a really large impact on terrestrial carbon and water fluxes. And so here I'll just highlight the terrestrial carbon cycle. This is a pretty simplified diagram. But the main thing that I want to highlight is the fact that there is only a single flux of carbon going into these ecosystems, and that is through photosynthesis. And that's there are other smaller fluxes, but photosynthesis is really the dominant flux of carbon into our ecosystems, and it's really the only primary flux of carbon into our ecosystems. And so it's a really important process. You also have large fluxes from soil respiration and plant respiration. But I want to highlight that photosynthesis, that flux is an order of magnitude larger than fossil fuel emissions. And so any changes to this process of photosynthesis is going to have pretty dramatic consequences on the global carbon cycle. So land is a critical sink of atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions. If you look at the Global Carbon Project emissions, you'll see that CO2 sources, most of it is coming from fossil fuel burning, but we're also getting some from land use change. And about a little less than half of it goes into the atmosphere, and the land takes up 30% of that carbon dioxide. The ocean takes up about a quarter of that carbon dioxide. And so the land really is an important component of terrestrial carbon storage and sequestering some of the anthropogenic emissions that we're emitting. So really the overarching question in my research is trying to understand how terrestrial ecosystems are responding to and contributing to environmental changes. And the fact is that humans are changing our ecosystems and the resources they provide at unprecedented rates, and trying to understand how terrestrial ecosystems from leaf to global scales will respond to these changes is a major and necessary challenge for society. So that's what drives my research and my motivation for this work. The tools that I use are varied. I use empirical data. This is a photo of the soy face site where we artificially increased elevated CO2. This is actually a temperature warming experiment there to try and understand how crops are responding to warmer temperatures. I also use ecological and environmental theory, so trying to understand processes and process representations, and then thinking about those within the context of Earth system models. And really, you need this suite of tools to answer a lot of different kinds of questions. And so it's a really powerful suite of tools, I guess, to try and measure and scale ecological processes, like I just mentioned with leaf to global scale processes. You can do that in an Earth system model, trying to understand complex interactions, things like disentangling multiple different drivers on processes. Determining the impact of human decisions. We can use Earth system models as a virtual planet rather than trying to do experiments on our actual planet, which I realize that we are doing, but hopefully we can minimize how much we're doing that. And then understanding the future of our ecosystems, and so what might happen in the future. All of these things are really important topics, and using the suite of tools, we can start to get at some of these types of questions. So the topics that I'm going to cover today, I'm going to start off, if you were at my talk yesterday, you heard me talk about ozone bioindicator gardens. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how air pollution impacts carbon and water cycling, more of the scientific aspect of that citizen science work. 2 is I will talk about how climate change impacts some of our natural resources. And last, we'll think about how plants influence climate. So we'll start with how air pollution impacts plants, and like I said, I will be focusing on ground level ozone. And for those of you who weren't there yesterday, just a quick update on ground level ozone. Ozone is a tricky pollution problem because, well, it's confusing problem, I should say, because it has different functions in different parts of our atmosphere. So in the second layer of our atmosphere, the stratosphere, is where the ozone layer is. And this ozone is beneficial to life on Earth. It is filled with ozone, and it acts as Earth's sunscreen. It blocks the harmful UV rays from hitting Earth's surface. And it is what has allowed life on Earth to evolve as we know it. At the ground level, though, the same exact chemical substance, when we breathe it, it's toxic to humans, and it's also toxic to plants. And ozone is a challenging problem because there is no such thing as a direct emission from a tailpipe. It is formed in the atmosphere, and the atmospheric formation requires nitrogen oxides. It requires volatile organic compounds, and these react in the presence of sunlight to form ground level ozone. Because ozone is toxic to humans and to plants, the EPA regulates it. So the limit for ozone is 70 parts per billion over the course of 8 hours, and they regulate the 4th highest 8-hour average. And so that's exactly what this map shows, is the ozone concentrations in the US, the 4th highest 8-hour average, and everything that is in yellow, orange, red is out of compliance with EPA's standards. And so you can see that there are many regions throughout the US that are out of compliance with EPA standards, including this region here, Salt Lake, and even up into Cache Valley. We have pretty bad ozone concentrations in California, also where I live in Colorado, all along the East Coast, and even throughout the Midwest. You'll also notice that there are not ozone monitors are not spatially distributed everywhere, and so there are places like Nebraska that don't really have many ozone monitors. Ozone monitors are expensive, and oftentimes we think about monitoring ozone concentrations where there is more human population, even though a lot of times ozone concentrations can be quite high in rural regions. All right, so ozone damage to plants can manifest as visible symptoms, and I showed these yesterday. So this is a particular variety of potato plant that was planted in June and exposed to ambient air in Boulder, Colorado. And by August, you started to see the first signs of ozone damage. So these are the stipples on the top surface of the leaf that cause ozone, that are symptomatic of ozone visible injury. And by late August, there was more extensive damage, and then by September, the damage was actually quite severe. So I am interested in the visible damage, and that's part of the citizen science project that I presented yesterday, but I'm also interested in the changes in carbon and water fluxes between leaves and the atmosphere. So I'm going to talk more about those, and to start, I'm just going to illustrate at the leaf level carbon and water exchange with the atmosphere in a very simplistic way. So this is a cross-section of a leaf, and carbon dioxide is taken from the atmosphere. It goes through these specialized cells called the stomatal cells. The size of the opening of those cells is what is stomatal conductance. And so the carbon dioxide goes into the stomatal cells. It travels through the intercellular space, which is filled with water, and it goes to the mesophyll layer, where it is fixed from carbon dioxide into sugars that the plant uses food. And it's this suite of processes from carbon dioxide entering the leaf to getting fixed into sugars that is the process of photosynthesis. So this is carbon gain from the leaf. At the same time, this intercellular space is all filled with water, and as the stomatal cells are open to gain that carbon dioxide, water is evaporating out from that leaf surface, or from the intercellular space, I should say, back out to the atmosphere. And so stomatal conductance is the only leaf level control on the process of transpiration. And so that's the stomatal cells are what link the carbon dioxide and the water exchange between the leaf back to the atmosphere. So I wanted to know how ozone affected both of these processes, carbon gain and water loss from the leaf surface. And so I set up an open top chamber experiment, and I measured leaves, and I also I did some experiments in growth chambers. This is a large part of my dissertation work. And I tried to get a better sense for how does ground level ozone change photosynthesis and stomatoconductance. And so what I'm going to show you next is the result of a synthesis of my own personal experimental work, but then a lot of other work that was done and published in the literature. And so this is a bar chart of the change in photosynthesis, which is in the green bars, and stomatoconductance, which are the blue bars. And this is the percent of control. So this 100% line means that there is no change. And with ozone damage on to these processes, you see that photosynthesis decreases, as does stomatoconductance. And the mean photosynthetic change was a decrease of about 21% across all of these plant types, whereas the mean change in stomatoconductance was only an 11% decrease across plant types. And so photosynthesis is changing more, it's decreasing more than stomatoconductance across a broad variety of plants. The other thing that I would like to emphasize is that for all of the literature, 95% of the available data are for temperate species. So we don't really have a solid understanding of what happens to plant or leaf level physiological processes outside of temperate species. We can assume that tropical species or high alpine or boreal species might respond the same to high levels of ozone, but they might also respond differently, and we don't actually know that information. So just to sort of reiterate, at the leaf level, ozone enters the leaf and has a large effect on photosynthesis because it damages the biochemical aspects of carbon fixation, and that does not directly affect stomatoconductance, but ozone does decrease stomatoconductance both through the fact that you have a buildup of carbon dioxide inside the leaf, as well as the fact that ozone can damage the functioning of the stomatal cells directly. So given that ozone changes photosynthesis and stomatoconductance, I wanted to know what happened on global scales. But before I get there, I just wanted to highlight that the stomatal cells link these processes, and as a result, the way that we often model photosynthesis and stomatoconductance is that stomatoconductance is calculated based on the rate of photosynthesis. And so when you decrease photosynthesis in a model because of ozone damage, you're getting a linear change in stomatoconductance, even though that's not what the data are showing us. And so I took the information from this data synthesis, and I scaled from leaf level to global to try and understand what happens to global carbon and water fluxes. And so I developed an algorithm that allowed me to separate the impact of ozone on photosynthesis and stomatoconductance, and that's what I incorporated into the community Earth system model. And this model is a large-scale Earth system model. I focus on just the land component of this model. And so this is a model that simulates whole Earth processes. It is one of only a few models in the US, but one of many models globally that tries to understand climate change and how the climate system is evolving. And so we have multiple different components here, and like I said, I'm focusing on the land components. But just to give you the reason that we have sort of balls of different sizes is because this is the size of the circles is proportional to the number of lines of code that is in this model. We have over 2 million lines of code, and most of that is in the atmosphere, but the land is definitely second place for the number of lines of code and complexity. And so in this model, we represent a variety of different processes. This is called the community land model. We represent surface energy fluxes, so fluxes of energy between the land surface and the atmosphere. We also represent hydrologic processes, and we represent biogeochemical cycles, and so carbon and nitrogen processes. And so like I said, I developed a suite of algorithms where I could affect, let's see, where are these processes? Transpiration through changing stomatoconductance and photosynthesis, so components of both the biogeochemical cycle and of hydrology. And so what I found is that ozone indeed decreases photosynthesis globally. So this is a decrease in total carbon gain by these ecosystems. And the significance here is that ozone reduces the carbon that is stored in our ecosystems. So we're storing less carbon, and that can have a big impact on climate because we're taking less carbon out of the air when we have higher ozone concentrations. And second, regions with the largest reductions in carbon storage are regions that are agricultural hotspots. So ozone is likely affecting our agriculture. So you can see here in the Midwestern United States, Europe, and parts of India and China, those are places that have some of the largest decreases in carbon gain due to ozone. At the same time, ozone does decrease transpiration, and so this is a direct decrease in water loss. And the significance here is that it can reduce evaporative cooling. That's one thing, and that's an important thing. I've actually worked with collaborators to show that there is a significant increase in temperature in some regions due to the reduction in evaporative cooling. And also the other thing that I want to point out here is that it decreases the coupling of carbon and water cycling. And so you'll notice that the regions with larger reductions in carbon gain, the reductions in water use are not as large. And so this is a direct reduction in water use efficiency, so the efficiency at which plants gain carbon per amount of water that's lost. And so this is important for thinking about how plants might respond to things like drought stress. They're still not going to gain as much carbon per unit water lost if they also have damage from ozone. So what I want to show you next is the fact that there are other ecosystem consequences, and I'm just going to highlight one. And this is just a photo to illustrate that plants use water. They take water from the soil through their roots, goes through the plant and out through the leaves, and that's the process of transpiration. And so if we are reducing the amount of water that's lost here, what do you think is going to happen to the amount of soil water here? It's going to increase, right? Because you're transpiring less water here, so you're not using as much water from the soil. And that is in fact what I did see from the results of this model simulation. And so this is change in total runoff due to ground level ozone impacting plants. And you'll notice, for example, in the Mississippi River Basin that we're getting a 10% increase in surface runoff. And so this could have implications for flooding potential in some of these regions. If we're damaging the plants so that they're not using as much water, there's not as much evaporative cooling, and there's potential for flooding in these regions. So just to sort of summarize this, ozone damage can cause visible and physiological damage to leaves, decreases photosynthesis, so it decreases carbon gain and water loss, but it decouples those so that the plants are less efficient at using water at the amount of water that they lose for the amount of carbon that they're gaining. And it also can change aspects of surface hydrology, including increased surface runoff. And so this is just a summary of the impacts, but I really want to highlight that if we can reduce ozone pollution, there are several benefits that are complementary to each other. We're improving human and ecosystem health, including probably increases in crop production and better health for humans. And at the same time, we're able to mitigate climate change through increased land carbon sink and also increased evaporative cooling. So both of those things are important. So that's all I'll share with you today about the impact of ozone on plants. And next, I will talk a little bit about how climate change impacts our natural resources. And so in particular here, I'm going to look at crop yields and wood biomass, and the wood biomass is sort of a proxy for what we would assume might happen to timber yields. But we don't actively, in this model that I have been using, we don't actively simulate timber, and so wood biomass is going to be our proxy. And so in the future, we expect that we're going to have increased carbon dioxide concentrations, warmer temperatures, and changing precipitation. So precipitation might increase or decrease depending on where you are. And so what would we expect from each of these things? So with higher CO2, we would expect an increase in productivity from CO2 concentration today to a future CO2 concentration. So we might see larger gain in ecosystem carbon or higher productivity due to the fact that there's more CO2 available for plant assimilation to use for growth. Warmer temperatures, on the other hand, I would expect to decrease productivity because it increases respiration and it can challenge plant functioning. This is probably true for some temperate and also tropical ecosystems. It might not be true in the higher latitudes, so keep that in mind. In changing precipitation, whether or not the precipitation gets drier or wetter is going to depend on the location. In some regions, if it gets drier, you're likely going to have less growth because plants are going to be more drought stressed. In regions where it gets wetter, you're likely to have more plant growth unless you have continual flooding, and at which point plant growth could decrease. I should say that for the purpose of what we do in model experiments, we lump temperature and precipitation together and call that changes in climate, whereas changes in CO2 are just changes in CO2, and that is one of the drivers of climate change, but it is not changing climate itself. So first, I will show you what happens to crop yields. We simulate 6 different types of crops in the community land model, and when we looked at a CO2 fertilization experiment, we added 200 parts per million of CO2. We see that there might be increases in some of the crop yields, and so here, I'm just showing the results for wheat to start, and you can see that the rain-fed crops the irrigated crops in CLM, which are the blue dots, increased in response to elevated CO2, as did the rain-fed crops responded even more. So they increased in response to elevated CO2, and they're within the range of observational uncertainty, both of these increases. It's perhaps a little higher than the average for observations, but within that range. That is not necessarily true for the rest of these crop types. Cotton, similarly, all of the crops pretty much increase in response to elevated CO2. So if you look at cotton, again, we're within the range of observational uncertainty. When we evaluated what happens to rice, notice that there's huge uncertainty in the model responses, but both the rain-fed and the irrigated are higher than what the observations suggest crop yields will respond to elevated CO2. Sugarcane, on the other hand, does not increase in response to elevated CO2, and this is actually, to me, not surprising because sugarcane is what we call a C4 photosynthetic plant. And in this type of photosynthesis, we actually don't expect that there is going to be an increase in productivity in response to CO2 because these plants are already adapted to low CO2 concentrations, and the way that their photosynthesis works is that they take CO2 and they compartmentalize it so that the plants have high CO concentrations at the site of carboxylation, or where that biochemistry is happening. Similarly, soy and corn yields in model land respond much higher than observations. Corn, again, is a C4 plant, and we wouldn't expect it to increase in photosynthesis, and in fact, that's what observations show. And so I would say, in general, the CO2 response in CLM is higher than what we would expect, and also irrigated crops are expected to have a lower response to elevated CO2 just because they're irrigated, and so they're not water stressed, and so the change in water use efficiency that we get with elevated CO2 doesn't really matter for irrigated crops. But what we find in CLM land is that often, and Bryce is a good example, the irrigated crops are actually responding more to elevated CO2, which is not what we would expect based on observations. So if we look at these patterns globally and look at crop yields, so this is elevated CO2 again, you can see that crop yields increase in most places globally. Perhaps this response is a little too high, but they do increase globally, and that's what we would expect based on observations. And similarly, wood biomass also increases. And so both of these responses are what we would expect in the future, that there increases. But we don't know if we think the magnitude might be a little too strong for CLM. And I should say, before I move on, that I'm talking about changes. So this is the change in the future. And so this is values around 2100 relative to 2015. And these are 10-year averages right around those periods of time. So next I want to show you climate change. And like I said, we're lumping temperature and precipitation here. And so you can see that climate change basically means warmer temperatures. So you can see that there's a lot of warming that's disproportionately higher as you get further north. And then we have changes in precipitation, and these are variable. You get increases in precipitation in some regions and decreases in precipitation in other regions. But what we find is that climate change, like I expected, does decrease both crop yields and wood biomass in many locations. But in high latitudes, you're actually seeing some increases because those regions were probably already temperature limited in terms of they were too cold for growth, and as the temperatures get warmer, it's increasing the optimum growth temperature for some of these plants to grow. And so the responses are generally, on average, you get a decline in both crop yields and wood biomass in the future, but there are a few regions where you start to see increases. And so next I want to show you the combined effect of carbon dioxide and climate. What wins? Is CO2 effect stronger than the climate effect? Well, it depends on where you're at. And I think a lot of times people expect that carbon dioxide is going to increase our resource production, and people sometimes ignore the effect of climate on natural resource production. And so you see here for crop yields, in some regions like the Corn Belt of the US, the effect of climate is actually stronger than the effect of elevated CO2 here. And so we're not getting strong increases in crop yields in that region. There are some increases in crop yields in other places in the US and also potentially in Europe, but there are significant decreases. And I think when you average this out globally, it ends up being about a 1% increase in crop yields in the future compared to present day. I should also highlight that this does not account for changes in management, so it doesn't account for any of those intensification processes. And so it's just thinking about CO2 and climate change. Similarly, wood biomass, it increases in many locations, but you do see some regions of decrease in the amount of wood biomass that is produced, notably in some of these regions in Canada and in northern latitudes across Europe and Asia. Okay, so just to sort of recap, carbon dioxide increases crop yields and wood biomass, but responses are higher than observations, at least for the crop yields that we have observational data for. Climate typically decreases crop yields and wood biomass in many locations, and the combined impact illustrates that the future changes really do vary by region, and so we need to be cognizant of where these changes are going to have large impacts. And the one thing that I will say is, are we going to be able to feed a growing population? It's not likely without intensive management. A 1% increase in crop yields in the future is not good enough for the population that is going to grow much more than 1%. And so we're going to need to think about intensive management that is going to allow us to increase crop yields. Converting land area to agricultural regions is not going to benefit climate, and so that's another thing that we need to think about. We need to try and be able to increase our yields on the current land area that we have, because otherwise we're going to start exacerbating climate change. All right, so I'll move on to the last part of this talk, is thinking about how plants influence climate. And so I'm going to think specifically about crops and management in the air system. And part of the reason is because agriculture changes the land surface. It changes how the land surface looks, which is important for physical impacts, and it also changes how the landscape functions, which is important for biogeochemical impacts. So I'm going to show you two examples of how plants influence their climate, and I'm going to start with cover crops. So cover crops, which are on the left here, are crops that are grown in between cash crop seasons. And so you can see that cover crops look different than the bare ground crops in this particular field. And part of the reason why people plant cover crops is because they provide many localized benefits. They suppress weeds and pathogens in these systems. They can help reduce erosion, reduce runoff, reduce nitrogen leaching. They can also increase soil infiltration and aeration, and they can do other things, have other impacts like improving nutrient cycling, soil pH, soil biota. So there's a lot of benefits to planting cover crops. These are all sort of localized field scale benefits. one of the things that I wanted to know is, how do cover crops impact climate? And so there are a couple of ways that cover crops can benefit climate, and I'm going to highlight a few of those here. And so one is the biogeochemical, cover crops can change the biogeochemical functioning of these ecosystems. And so they can change CO2 fluxes into the ecosystem and also soil carbon sequestration through the plant biomass. They might also change greenhouse gas emissions. And I would say that in general, the research suggests that cover crops are really important for increasing soil carbon sequestration, and the jury is still sort of out on these trace gas emissions. It depends a lot on which type of cover crop you grow and what kind of ecosystem you're in, as to whether cover crops increase or do not change trace gas emissions that are important for climate. And so we have done research on the biogeochemical consequences of cover crops, but less is understood about the biogeophysical impacts. These are largely not being measured, and I'm going to focus on the biogeochemistry, the biogeophysical impact, because it's easier to quantify the changes in temperature. And so things that are important for the biogeophysical impact are things like changes in albedo, which is the reflectivity of the land surface, and then soil evaporation and transpiration, so total evapotranspiration or latent heat flux, if you want to think about that in energy terms. And also you might see some changes in surface roughness. And so even though biogeochemical impacts are important, like I said, I'm focusing on the biogeophysical impacts. And this is kind of what I would expect that adding cover crops will do. If you think about albedo, I would expect that cover crops might decrease albedo, which would have the effect of warming temperature. So you're planting darker crops on the land surface rather than the brighter soils, and so that will decrease the amount of light energy that is being reflected back to climate, and so that could cause a net warming effect on climate. Surface roughness, I would think, might increase because we're adding plants, and so that surface is rougher, which can increase turbulent mixing. But cover crops are relatively short and they're relatively uniform, and so I would expect this impact to actually be somewhat small. If roughness does increase, then it will lead to some potential cooling through that turbulent mixing. And then evapotranspiration might also increase. So this is soil and canopy evaporation plus transpiration. And if this increases, you're increasing the evaporative cooling of the land surface. And so I wanted to know, what is the net effect on temperature? Does albedo win? Does evapotranspiration win? Does roughness tip the balance here? It's hard to say. So I used the community land model and I coupled it to an atmosphere model this time to try and understand how these cover crops might impact climate. And I used an idealized scenario. So this is not necessarily a realistic scenario, but my idealized scenario planted cover crops in all crop regions throughout North America, with the goal of determining the impact of cover crops on winter temperature compared to having bare ground during that winter. And so, like I said, I used the atmosphere component coupled to the land component here, so these two talked to each other. And that way, changes in the land surface could impact the atmosphere, and we could better understand what the effect was on temperature. And so what I found is that that cover crops might increase winter temperatures in snowy regions. And so this is one of my figures that shows these warmer winter temperatures in the Midwestern part of the United States, going up through the western, sort of more of the western part of Canada. And so these temperature increases are actually somewhat large. They're up to 3 degrees Celsius, which is like 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit. But part of the reason why the cover crops here impacted winter temperature is because they were sticking up above the snow. And so if you decrease the cover crop height, and you actually see the same thing for having the cover crops be less leafy, you're actually not seeing a significant change in temperature anymore in the winter. And so this just illustrates that cover crops, if they're shorter, they might reduce that impact on winter warming. And so, like I said, the warming is primarily due to the reduced winter albedo. So you can see that there's a strong decrease in albedo here in the same region where we saw the temperature increase. And we did see an increase in latent heat flux, but this wasn't warm enough this wasn't large enough to counteract the warming caused by the change in albedo. And there's part of me that we haven't ever measured these processes. We don't know if they occur, but when I was flying into the Denver airport the other day, I looked down and it had started to snow, and I noticed that the bare ground looked snow-covered, whereas the cover crop, or the area that had some crops, was actually, you can see the snow in between the rows there, but you can see how much darker this is compared to the bare ground. And so this just illustrates the point that I'm trying to make, is that if you have snow on the bare ground, or if you have crops that are sticking up above that snow surface because the snow isn't deep enough to cover those crops, you might see some of that wintertime warming. And so I actually feel like we really need to go out and measure some of these processes, because I'm not saying that the model gets everything correct. I don't think it does. But this provides us with a good hypothesis that we should go out and test in the field. And so I think that it's important to follow this up with a field experiment to actually see if the cover crops do contribute to winter warming, if they're sticking up above the snowpack, and if we can either mow or graze those cover crops, or plant cover crops less densely, perhaps, to decrease the impact on winter temperature. So just to summarize the potential impact of cover crops might increase winter temperatures if they do stick above the snowpack. And so the impact is primarily in snowy regions where the effect of albedo dominates. And we do have the potential to minimize winter warming with shorter cover crops and also with less leafy cover crops. And so back to this image of the land surface and talking about how agriculture changed the land surface. And I just showed you a way that changing how it looks can impact climate, but how it functions is also important for the biogeochemical cycles. And so I'm just going to give a quick example of the importance of agriculture and agricultural representation in these models for biogeochemistry and carbon cycle feedbacks. So in the community land model, this is the first Earth system model that is including the representation of crops in a comprehensive way. One of my roles at NCAR is to actually coordinate the development of this crop model. There are other Earth system models that have included some representations of crops, but they can't simulate changes in crops through time, and they don't always simulate them globally. And so this is a comprehensive representation where we can actually look at crop yields and the impact that agriculture has on our climate system. And crops are different from natural vegetation in the model in that we plant them at specific times, we harvest them at specific times, and we also have management in the form of applying nitrogen fertilizer, and we also apply water to irrigate these crops. And so these are different from natural vegetation, because natural vegetation the trees are not planted at a given point in time, they're not harvested, and they're also not receiving nitrogen from fertilizer or irrigated water. And so one of the things that I've been looking at is how does the representation of crops in these models change carbon fluxes. And so the managed crops, like I said, are planted, harvested, and irrigated, and also fertilized. And generic crops, which is how earlier versions of the community land model represented crops, and how most other Earth system models represent crops, they're represented as basically C3 grasses. So they're not planted, they're not irrigated, they're not harvested, they're not fertilized, but they function sort of as C3 grasses. And so I'm going to show you next the carbon fluxes as a result of these changes in how we represent crops. So this is a graph of net ecosystem exchange, and it's an annual cycle. So from January through December, and this is averaged, I guess I didn't write it on here, but this is averaged from 1990 through 2010. So it's a 20-year annual average. And this dotted line is the zero line. So anything below this line is a net carbon gain, and that's due to photosynthesis. So there's the photosynthetic drawdown of carbon, and anything above this line is the net carbon loss. So I sort of think of this line as the land surface, and anything below it is going into the land surface, and anything above it is going back to the atmosphere. And so the thing that I want to point out here is that the managed crops are in purple, and so when we plant, harvest, fertilize, irrigate our crops, they're taking up more carbon dioxide in general than when we represent crops as grasses. And this is not averaged for just these crop areas. This is averaged for all of the northern hemisphere. And so you can see this impact of representing agriculture in our model for the entire northern hemisphere. And I want to just bring this back to this annual cycle. You'll notice that this pattern is similar. This pattern in net ecosystem exchange is similar to the annual cycle that we see in that carbon dioxide, the Keeling curve, the carbon dioxide curve. And the reason that this is important is because there have been studies showing that the seasonal amplitude of carbon dioxide is increasing. And so the difference between the trough and the peak here is changing through time. It's been increasing through time. And there have been some studies that show that there is a direct human influence on that amplitude of carbon dioxide seasonality from increased cropland productivity. There's also increased productivity in high latitude ecosystems due to extended growing season, but cropland productivity accounts for about a quarter of that increase. And Earth system models have not been able to capture that increase, but now that we are able to actively represent crops, I think that we can start capturing some of those processes better. So to me, this is a really exciting advancement for Earth system models because we can better understand what's going to happen to our food resources in the future, but we can also better understand how agriculture and agricultural management can contribute to and help mitigate climate change. So just to summarize, cover crops might increase winter temperature with shorter cover crops, potentially minimizing that winter warming, and also just highlighting that crops and the representation of crops in models can change annual carbon cycle fluxes. So we need to represent them in Earth system models because it's necessary for understanding carbon climate feedbacks. And this is really important because in order to minimize warming in the future, we really need to think about reducing carbon fluxes into the atmosphere. And if we're going to hit the Paris Accord by 2030, we need to have net neutral emissions. And by 2050, we need to be taking carbon dioxide out of the air. So we need to be a net sink. And that's only going to happen with land surface management or geoengineering. But I feel more comfortable with land surface management. So I hope that I have showed you that air pollution can impact plants. It's important for carbon and water cycling. Reducing the impact of air pollution, reducing the amount of air pollution can actually benefit climate as well by taking more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Climate change will impact our natural resources, and if we're not careful and we're not thinking about how to manage our resources in the future, we might not have enough food and or timber to meet society's needs. And last, plants do influence climate, and so we can think about strategies for managing our land surface to help minimize climate impacts and also potentially to mitigate climate change. So we really need to be smart about our management decisions and think about that in the context of climate. So I will end there, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have them. Yeah.
You had that region map of, I think it was ozone and the 70 parts per million threshold.
Mm-hmm. You
said, but the new threshold at 70 is not currently enforced. What does that enforcement look like? So I'm not an expert on the policy side of things, but oftentimes when you're out of compliance or when a region is out of compliance with federal standards, the federal government can say, okay, we're going to take away highway funding for your state until you start meeting these regulations. And so that's what it is. They have not been regulating the 70 parts per million. They've been regulating the 75 parts per billion. That is changing. I'm most familiar with the ozone problem in Colorado because we've been out of compliance with the EPA's standards for over a decade. And just this past year, Governor Polis decided that we're going to tackle this issue. And most of the time, a lot of times what states will do is they'll file a petition to give us more time to come into compliance. But we keep doing that. And so Governor Polis actually said, we're not going to do that again this year. We're going to actually fix our air quality problem because it's good for human health. And so by doing that, what happened is the EPA well, the Trump administration slapped back and said, okay, then we're calling you serious non-attainment and you're going to get all sorts of fines and we're not going to give you funding if you don't fix it almost immediately. So I don't know what's going to happen with that. Ozone is really a summertime pollution problem. It's really, because it's an indirect source, it's a very challenging pollution problem to solve because you need to actually regulate NOx and volatile organic compounds. But both of those are produced naturally, as well as they've increased quite a bit, quite considerably through human emissions. But in the Front Range of Colorado, the northern part of the Front Range, up near Fort Collins, there's a lot of oil and gas fracking, and so there's a lot of methane emissions. Methane is one of the contributors. It's one of the VOCs that contributes to ozone formation. And so it's the high VOCs in that region, and in Denver, it's the NOx from all of the vehicle emissions. And so, both of those things are going to be important, and they're tough to regulate. But basically it comes down to things like taking away highway funding and federal funding for state projects. Yeah, there's a couple of questions.
So just a question that idealized experiment in your crop height change.
Uh-huh.
So you just only show the winter temperature, just wondering if there any change in summer temperature and the precipitation as well?
So we did not see any changes in the summer temperatures, and that's why I didn't present those. Because the summer is the cash crop season, so that's when the normal crop growing season is, and so we don't have the cover crops there, and so the land surface doesn't actually look that different during the summer. The shoulder seasons, we also didn't see temperature changes, which I was a little bit surprised by, but I just think that we're not, this is not a fully realistic simulation, and so I think that there are other processes. I think that it could change some of the temperatures, and I also think that it can change precipitation, but the precipitation signal was not clear either. It did change soil moisture, but I don't think it was, I'm trying to remember if it was a significant change or not. I can send you the paper if you're interested in looking at it more. Yeah.
Different kind of a question. You work at the National Center for Atmospheric Research.
Mm-hmm.
Global carbon is higher than 400 parts per million.
Mm-hmm.
We pulled out of the Paris Accords. When you go to work, are you and your colleagues happy and excited and energized, or are you just all completely bummed out? I mean, this is a room full of young people, and I'm just wondering whether your take is that the young people in this room are just screwed and are going to enter the world of massive population displacement and a world that we can't produce enough food, and or just what's the vibe? Do you think we're going to dodge this bullet or not?
That's a loaded question. I mean, I would say we are pretty bummed out with the federal policy. On a day-to-day basis, we don't walk around feeling depressed all the time because we need to try and do something about it. I think this room full of young people is inspiring and energizing because this is going to be the face of change. We need to change it. And if we walk around bummed out and depressed all the time, we're not going to affect change. And so I think that we have to stay positive as much as we can and just try and do our part to make a difference. And I think part of that is talking about it, talking to our friends and family, talking to the government. The climate marches have been inspiring as well, especially led by the youth. It's been, there's a lot of inspiration given the stark reality of what the federal government's policies are. So I think it's a mixed bag. We definitely have been upset about the fact that, the pulling out of the Paris Accord is sort of a political stunt, I think. I think that there's a lot of local governments that are still going to try and meet those targets. And I think that that's important. I think sometimes the local governments have to show that it can be done. And maybe that's the way forward. I don't know. I don't know the right answer to that question, but I think we still need to try and work. We just need to keep taking one step forward, as much as we can so that we can make progress.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Have you looked at if there's a certain crop or type of crop that is particularly
I have not specifically done that just because our crop model is so new and we're only representing 6 types of crops. But I think it's a really interesting question to think about and to address. I'm not sure if it's going to be any of these major crop types, and I think one of the things that's challenging about crops is that we are putting nutrients and resources into the soil that then we're removing and consuming and not putting them back. So I actually think things like residue management are going to be important. With corn, there's a huge amount of plant, for example, that is coming off of the ecosystems if we're harvesting all that residue and we're only eating some of those stalks of corn or using those for feed. So I think that there's possibilities. I don't know the answer, and I think it's an important question because I think it's going to depend on the roots and the root systems as well. That's going to be an important part of it. Yeah.
So my question, I think, links the previous question, the question before that. There's a lot of talk these days about the potential for biomass management to ameliorate climate change, right?
Yeah.
And I'm curious what your thoughts are about that, the size of that potential sink, terrestrial sink, compared to the size of the possible emissions that we're going into the future, and how much of an offset that really is, and is it more than just a short-term bonus type?
Yeah, I mean, that's also a hard question to answer. I mean, a lot of these are hard questions to answer, right? But I think, so there's an initiative, it's the 4 per mil initiative, which is trying to sort of balance the amount of fossil fuel emissions with the management that is sequestering, so the terrestrial service that's sequestering that. I do think that we're going to reach sort of a threshold of, there's only so much carbon that we can get into our soils. There's only, so much that we can do. I've been working on a project with a graduate student from Virginia Tech who's been looking at no-till agriculture and also residue management in terms of soil carbon storage. And what he has found is that the no-till is not going to be the silver bullet that we need. No-till over the past 150 years, according to what we can glean from the model globally, is equivalent to 1 year's worth of fossil fuel emissions approximately. And so it's not, no-till isn't going to help as much as we would like. Residue management can have a bigger impact, and so that's what he's found with some of the removal of the plant biomass. And so that's part of, that's another aspect of it. And I think that there's not going to be one management practice that's going to solve this problem. And I think land management is going to be important, and I hope that we can incentivize our farmers and ranchers to follow practices that store more carbon, but I also think it's an unfair burden just to put on them. I think we really need to reduce emissions quite drastically, and we need to think about that side of impacts, but we need both right now. We're going to need that sort of engineering perspective of thinking about the land surface taking up more carbon dioxide and how to maximize that, as well as reducing our emissions. So, yeah, it's a hard problem. I don't know that there's one solution, but...
I was curious, when you talked about the potential for increased surface runoff, did you combine that with changes in precipitation?
No, I just ran those. Those simulations are just for like present day, what happens if we had no ozone compared to ozone. And so it didn't account for changes in precipitation, but I think that would be something that would be interesting to look at. It's not something that I've done yet. Other questions? Yeah.
I was wondering if the community land model has farming impacts and whether or not you've compared crop management scenarios versus farming scenarios and what the difference is between those and as far as carbon emissions.
What do you mean by farming scenarios?
Like if we increase more cattle or less cattle.
So we don't include land mammals yet in management of that, but it is something that we've been talking about, pasture and pasture management. We have been working on a manure portion of the module to try and understand the impact of manure. And so that's starting to get at some of those things. And so I would say in general, at this point, no, but I think it's on the horizon and people recognize its importance. It's just not been represented yet. So I think that that's a path forward that we need to think about more. And if I would say if anybody is interested in this model and working on this model, we do always welcome visitors to NCAR to learn more about it. We run tutorials. There's a full CESM tutorial, which is the whole coupled earth system model, and that runs every year in August. And then we run, I run the community land model tutorial, which happens every 2 to 3 years. We just ran it in February this past year, so it probably will be another year, but that gets more in depth onto the land surface processes. And so, if these types of questions are interesting to you, please pursue them. It's a community model, and so we're always excited to have more people working with us to help drive some of these questions. And I think that that's a really exciting part of this process. All right.
All right. Thank you all.